Dracula, the Deal. The fluorescent hum of the lab lights was the only sound as Dr. Elena Vasquez scribbled furiously on her tablet, oblivious to the storm raging outside. Raindrops streaked the glass walls of her high-tech fortress, perched on the edge of the city. She was chasing immortality, though not in the poetic sense. Cellular regeneration was her obsession, a cure for decay, for weakness, for death. She would be the one to conquer time. The creak of the lab door startled her. She turned sharply, clutching a scalpel instinctively. A man stepped inside, tall and imposing, his dark coat dripping rainwater onto the pristine floor. His pale, angular face was framed by jet-black hair, and his eyes glimmered like molten gold.
Dr. Vasquez.
His voice velvet and menace intertwined.
You work late.
Who the hell are you?
She snapped, backing away toward the emergency alarm.
How did you get in here?
He smiled faintly.
Your security is impressive, but not infallible. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Count Dracula.
Elena blinked, then laughed nervously.
You're joking. What, are you some eccentric lunatic? Did the asylum lose one of its patients?
She reached for her phone.
I'm calling the police.
In a blur, he was upon her, his hand clamped around her throat, not choking but firm, commanding. His eyes bore into hers, and the world seemed to fall away. In an instant, she was plunged into a torrent of images. Bloody battlefields, castles wreathed in shadow, a line of faces. Lovers, enemies, victims. She saw centuries of dominance, pain, and power. Felt the weight of his immortality pressing down on her soul. When he released her, she staggered, clutching the counter for support. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hand trembling as she wiped sweat from her brow.
Do you understand now?
He asked, his voice as cold and sharp as a dagger. Elena nodded, her defiance replaced by a terrified fascination.
You're real.
Very real. And I have a proposition for you.
Over the next hour, Elena listened as Dracula outlined his request. A serum that would make him immune to sunlight. He praised her brilliance, citing her groundbreaking research as the key to his evolution. In return, he offered her immortality, the very thing she had pursued for years. But as he spoke, Elena's mind churned. She saw the opportunity not to serve him, but to surpass him. If she could manipulate his ancient blood, she could take his power for herself.
I'll need time,
she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of ambition brewing within her.
Your biology is unprecedented. I need to run tests, refine the serum.
Take all the time you need,
Dracula said, his smile unreadable.
But do not mistake my patience for leniency.
Days turned into weeks as Elena worked obsessively, analyzing Dracula's blood. It pulsed with an unearthly vitality, defying the limits of human comprehension. Her lab became a fortress of secrecy. The windows darkened, the outside world forgotten. Finally, the serum was ready. Or so she told him. When Dracula returned that night, his presence filled the lab like a storm cloud.
Have you done it?
He asked, his voice a smooth blade.
You've given me exactly what I wanted.
Yes,
Elena said, holding up the syringe. Her hand was steady, but her heart raced.
this will make you invincible.
Did you really think that I would trust you?
He said, his voice low and deadly. Elena's smile faltered. With a swipe of his hand, he sent her crashing against the wall. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, faster than she could react, he was upon her. His hand gripped her throat like iron, lifting her slightly off the ground. Her vision blurred as his eyes bored into hers, a flood of images cascading into her mind. His conquests, his losses, his ancient and unrelenting power. She felt exposed, her thoughts no longer her own. She spoke, her inhibition gone.
You should have been more careful, Count. The serum doesn't make you immune to sunlight. It makes you mortal.
Dracula's lips curled into a dangerous smile.
Treachery.
Eleanor gasped as he released her, dropping her to the floor. She scrambled backward, but his voice halted her.
You thought you could deceive me.
She stammered, but he silenced her with a glance.
You've done as I instructed,
He said, his tone calm but laced with menace.
The true serum is in the cryogenic unit.
Eleanor froze, her mind racing. How had he known? His will wrapped around her like chains, forcing her body to move against her own desires. She rose, walked to the unit, and retrieved the second syringe, the one she had meant to hide. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes as her hand betrayed her, discarding the false serum and replacing it with the correct one. Dracula extended his arm, a dark smile playing on his lips.
Now fulfill your end of the bargain.
Helpless, she injected him with the serum. For a moment he stood still, his eyes closing as the dark liquid coursed through his veins. Then a wave of power seemed to ripple through him. His body straightened, his skin glowing faintly as though illuminated from within. When his eyes opened, they burned with an unholy light.
It is done,
he said, his voice resonating with a new, terrifying authority. Elena staggered back, her control over her own body returning. She tried to run, but he caught her effortlessly, his hand gripping her shoulder.
You sought to betray me,
he murmured, his voice low.
You wanted immortality,
he whispered, his breath cold against her neck.
And now I'll grant you your wish.
She screamed as his fangs pierced her neck, pain and euphoria intertwining as darkness claimed her. Her last thought a bitter realization: she had not conquered death, she had become its servant. When Elena awoke, her senses were sharper, her body thrumming with unnatural energy. Dracula stood over her, his gaze triumphant.
Welcome to eternity,
he said.
You're mine now.
Elena realized the truth. She had traded her humanity for power, and in doing so, had lost everything.